Okay, here with the incredible David Jernigan. David, thank you so much for joining me for this, How They Hire Clip. Wanted to just start with, who are you and where have you worked?
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm David Jernigan. I've had the amazing opportunity to be in the education and nonprofit youth development space in Atlanta for over the past 25 years. I've spent a significant amount of my time with KIPP Atlanta schools, but also had a 6-year stint as Deputy Superintendent of Atlanta Public Schools and then served as the CEO for the Boys and Girls Clubs here in Metro Atlanta. So excited to be with you today.
Right. Thank you. Okay, I love some of the questions that I've seen you ask our candidates before, and you and I know each other from hiring together for the KIPP Atlanta CEO. One of the questions that I have for you is just what's a question that you always ask candidates and why that?
Yeah, I picked up a question during my early days at KIPP that I have carried with me into every job since then. And the question is a self-awareness question. And it is specifically, what do people who don't like you say about you? And I always word the question in that very specific way because I know that it can be a little jarring for some candidates, but I think it's important to ask it in that way because it helps to understand from the candidate's perspective, do they understand that there may be people who don't like them or don't like their style, and how self-aware are they really about that? And then most importantly, it's the follow-up from that. So when they are able to be vulnerable and transparent in what they recognize about themselves that may not be something everybody loves about them, then it's sort of, then how do you, and I think it's important to clarify, like, it's not about necessarily changing who you are, but how you can be reflective about how you show up in the space as a leader and how you might have to adjust your style at certain times based upon who your audience is. So that's my favorite self-awareness question.
I do. I love that. And like, what are some of the follow-ups that you ask right after it's like, okay, what's someone who doesn't like you? What would they say about you? What are some of the questions that kind of come up as follow-ups?
Well, a lot of times the first initial response is, I can't think of anyone who doesn't like me. And so that's often the initial response, which then I go down a path of really unpacking that. And, most interview questions are meant to be more personal, more professional in nature, but I use it as an opportunity to also explore, think outside of even the workplace. There might be aspects of your personality because how you show up as a person is very much how you show up as a leader and how you show up as an employee. And so just understanding and sort of pushing them to think even outside of the professional context, because often those annoying qualities we have as a person are also annoying qualities that we have as a leader.
It's really good. Oh, it's really good. I can't believe someone said, like, I don't have any. That's wild. Okay, you can talk about your time at KIPP, APS, Boys and Girls Club, but how have you helped candidates get an honest, real understanding of what it's like to work in an organization with you?
Yeah, I think it starts with, first of all, the interview process itself tells the candidate a lot about the organization, how thorough it is, how well organized it is. And honestly, I think the assignments can go a long ways to helping a candidate really understand the organization. So particularly if I've hired for senior level roles, there's almost always an assignment that gives them some intel into the organization. So there's something about a data review, something that allows them to do a strategy project that helps them to understand a strategic issue the organization's facing. So that's one important way. When you get to sort of the final stages, though, I think it's important for candidates to have the chance to spend time with the organization. In a school setting, that meant like come and spend an entire day at the school, getting to know the kids, the staff, and let us see how you interact with, our stakeholders. Not every role lends itself to that. So I think the alternative to that is spending time with candidates in informal settings with members of the team that they'll be working with. That can be informal lunch, coffee meetings, and those sorts of things.
So good. Okay. I love that. And I love the idea that the pre-work assignment is like, here's the real of what's happening here. They can use that to their advantage. Okay. What is your secret sauce when it comes to closing strong talent? How do you get people to sign on the dotted line? Because you've gotten a lot of really good people to work for you.
Yeah, I think it's a tricky balance. I've always believed that it should be as much as their decision as it is ours, right? And so it's a mutual process. And I think of it like dating. In a dating context, you don't want to work too hard to convince someone to be your partner. And so I think similarly, if I have to work too hard to recruit you, I do wonder if like you really want this as bad as we want it. Having said that, I mean, I do think it's important that you demonstrate to a candidate that you're serious about their candidacy. And for me, I don't think there's any secret sauce to it. It's largely just been about like building a personal connection. And so, that can be as simple as like, hey, before you sign on the dotted line, or before you think further about this opportunity, why don't we go get dinner, go get coffee? And particularly if I'm going to be your manager, and for us to get to know each other in a more personal way, to just get a sense of like what it would be like to work together. As the saying goes, people don't work for organizations, they work for people. And so making sure that there's that personal connection, I think is probably the most important thing.
That's powerful. And I think we skip that a lot of times. What is your best advice to a first-time hiring manager? And then I have a follow-up about founding.
I think I would say don't underestimate the power of informal reference checks. And what I mean by that, in most communities, the education space is a relatively small ecosystem. And it's not too hard to find out inside information about how people experience that person in their prior roles. It sometimes takes some digging, and it sometimes takes some unofficial digging that I know perhaps recruitment firms don't necessarily do on their own for legal reasons. And, you're always going to run into challenges getting the real deal through reference checks, particularly if employers have set legal parameters that prevent employers from giving out information. But I have avoided so many bad hires over the years by getting to the right person. And I often will say to the candidate, very rarely will I accept that a candidate won't let me speak to their current employer. And I have to if I can't speak to their current employer, in the initial stages, before I make the final offer, it's necessary to me. But at a minimum, I need to speak to other previous managers and to really understand how they showed up as an employee. So often folks will give, colleagues or, former professors or folks that just really haven't experienced them as an employee. And I will not accept that. And I think it's important to take the time to do the reference checks, because you can just avoid a lot of pain by doing that.
Have you ever had a situation where the candidate was like, you cannot talk to my boss? And if so, what did you make of that?
Yeah, I do try to understand the context, and there are situations where it is hard because, they may work for a boss that if they found out they were looking and they didn't get the job, there might be retaliation and that sort of thing. And so I try to understand the context before I push too hard for that, which is why I think that the backup is twofold. One, it's okay, fine. I won't reach out to your manager until we're ready to make an offer. But at that point, I really do need to talk to your manager. And the alternative is, if that really is a non-negotiable, then you've got to provide me with several former managers that you've worked for an extended period of time. And if you can't come up with those because you've jumped around too much, that's a red flag.
Speaking of which, what are some flags that you look for or like catch in an interview process that make you second guess whether you should hire someone? I have mine. I'm curious what yours are.
I go back to the initial question around self-awareness. For me, that is the number one thing I'm looking for. If you lack self-awareness, it's going to be hard to coach you. I found it really difficult to develop talent for people that just aren't self-aware and aren't vulnerable and aren't willing to be coached. And it's more than just what do people don't like you say about you. It's really owning your previous mistakes. Do you take accountability for areas where you have fallen down in the past, and are you reflective about that? So anyone who doesn't seem reflective, I think is a red flag for me. I would say very similar to that is just arrogance generally. I cannot stand arrogance. And so when I see it, I think it is a red flag for me. And then I would just say, if this feels like it's more about a job than a alignment with mission and a passion for the mission, the job's going to get old pretty quickly. And so, I've worked in the spaces of like mission-oriented organizations, and mission alignment's critical. So if I don't feel and sense a passion from you about the mission, and that includes an understanding of the communities that we serve. I think cultural competency is another thing that I really probe for and have in the 25 years that I've been doing this work, because you have to have an appreciation for the communities that you're serving, come at it from a strengths-based perspective. I've eliminated a lot of candidates who come in with kind of a deficit mindset around the kids and families we serve. And so those are some of the things that have been red flags for me in the past. What are some of your red flags? I know I'm being interviewed, but I'm curious.
No, I love it. No. You're going to be like really tailored, but one of the biggest ones is the number of times you contact me about a phone call that we have, or about like questions about an assignment. And like, I've had people call me, text me, email me. I just ruled somebody out of a process for that reason, because it tells me that you're disorganized and scattered.
Mm,
And I don't want my client to even meet you for an interview, because that executive functioning piece, and I'm someone who has ADHD, like executive functioning is the thing I work on. But for me, that feels really frustrating. And then another flag is like, sometimes people will just kind of what you said. It's just like, this is just another job. I don't know if I want to, really how much time I would invest. And so
yeah.
those things are jobs. And then there are some folks who just jump year to year to year. There's some people I see in my processes every year, like the same names. And it
Yeah.
just makes me wonder, like, what's going on here? And so I
Yeah.
actually did have a conversation with someone this year, but he's like, I said, I see your name every single year in my application
Mm,
pipeline for like 5 different jobs. What is the deal?
yeah.
I was like, if you're looking for a home, you're not being like exclusive enough. Like, you need to think about what you're looking for in terms of the culture. And then he's also someone who's bounced around multiple times. So
Mm,
those are my flaws.
yeah.
Like, good question, David. I like answering my own question. Okay. And then as a founder, what are some of like the top pieces of advice that either you followed from the Fisher Fellowship or you developed on your own, like how to hire a stellar team that grows together over time?
Yeah, I mean, I think the initial staff that you bring on says so much about what you value.
Yes.
For me, it was important to be really clear about my core values as I was starting KIPP Waves Academy and then KIPP Atlanta here in Atlanta. And then I think with that, intentionality around the diversity of talent that I was bringing on was really important. Because what I found, because I started off and set, I think, a really clear indication to the Atlanta community that I was committed to building a diverse team that was reflective of the kids and communities that we serve. Every year it made it easier and easier to do that, because as I was looking at candidates to come in year 2 and year 3, they looked at my staff and said, he's working hard to build a diverse team. But if I had not started off like that, and I know some of my colleagues in the Fisher Fellowship world weren't able to do that in their first couple of years, and then it made it way harder to bring in diverse talent from there. So that's probably the first thing. And then, I guess I would just say it is easy when you are starting out, and especially if you've not had the benefit of hiring much, to get excited about candidates, who you first meet, because you're just starting off. And, when someone seems excited about joining your team, you get energized by it, and maybe don't hold the highest bar for the kind of talent that you need. And so I think just being really clear about the caliber of talent you need, from the outset, and being clear about the difference between asking for a recruiting a founding staff member versus someone who's coming into a more established organization. There's just a certain level of work ethic, openness to ambiguity, flexibility that is required when you're coming onto a founding team versus a more established organization.
I totally agree with that. And I do believe diversity begets diversity, right?
That's
So if
right.
you're starting with a strong foundation, folks are coming in to interview. I see people who look like me. Okay, this is now when we're over engineering and trying to bring in, this person or that person to show that we have people of color on our team. Like, that's when
That's
I
right.
know we've made a mistake. How did you build your team out? Like, did you guys do referrals? Like, what did you rely on to get great teachers over the course of the 4 years of building?
Early on, I was leaning heavily on the TFA alumni network in
Very interesting.
Atlanta. I was a part of the charter corps here in Atlanta. And so I had, a personal network of connections from there. And then we leaned heavily on connections from those teachers who then, connected us to some of their former colleagues. So it was a lot of personal referrals.
Yeah.
Um, and then honestly, I used parents as well, because
Oh,
I would say to some of my families, like, you've had your kids in teachers' classrooms over the years. Some of the best teachers that your kids have benefited from.
that's
Send them
good.
our way. And so I think that's parents are the best measure of like a quality teacher. They know best for their kids, and so I used a lot of parent referrals as well.
I love that. And I think it's like the referrals also beget referrals. You
That's
know,
right.
it's important for a founding team to understand that, like, you are the foundational building blocks of this school, and it is on you just as much as it is on me to bring in great talent to help build out each grade.
That's right.
Okay, I know I've said plenty, and I love what you've shared. Is there any other piece of advice that you want to share with folks out there about hiring?
Can't think of anything else. I think we've covered everything that I have
Oh,
to offer.
One question for you. Something that keeps coming up, sorry, that people keep asking me is what questions are okay to ask in the interview? Like, at the end when it's like you have a couple minutes to ask the employee, them any questions. What, like, is that a good time for employees to ask about salary? Is that a good time for them to ask about hybrid work, or is that more of a time for to ask about, biggest challenges you're facing? Like, what questions don't raise flags for you in that last kind of section?
I'm looking for candidates who ask really thoughtful questions, particularly when there's an audience in the room. If they're doing a panel interview and they have board members, they have other senior leaders in the organization, that is not the time to ask logistical questions or, things that you can ask HR about after the interview.
Yes.
It is a perfect opportunity to understand people's personal connections to the mission, why they are personally invested and involved, what their stories are. That demonstrates an ability to relate and connect with their future colleagues or stakeholders they'll be working with. So that's definitely one. And then I think, insight around the biggest challenge, strategic questions about the future of the organization. That demonstrates that they've done their homework and that they are really being thoughtful about the search. And it's less about just, to your point, checking the box on things like salary or hybrid work environment.
Good. Okay, that's perfect.